Hello.
Hello. Okay. Go ahead.
It's very nice to finally meet you on, even though it's all
Likewise.
over screen.
That's fine. Sometimes it's the only way we're able to meet these days. Yeah. Better for the planet.
Apart. Let's see. All right. How about we start with a short introduction from both sides? Would you like
Okay.
me to begin first?
Do you want to begin? Yeah.
My name is Abha, and I am currently a master's student in biology.
Mhm.
I'm the team lead for an iGEM project from IISER Thiruvananthapuram this year, and we're collaborating with our in-house magazine as well as our Pride Club to
Mhm.
have a tripartite collaboration to talk about queer people in STEM, and queer people's mental health in STEM.
All right. Very cool. I'm Bittu. I'm a faculty member at Ashoka University. I teach neuroscience, so I'm in both the biology and psychology departments. And yeah, I'm a genderqueer trans man, and there are very few of us. Well, there's actually none of us that I know of among tenured faculty in STEM, but lots and lots of youngsters who I hope will populate the field. And yeah, that's it.
All right. So, how about we start with that itself, as in what sort of circumstances conspired to make you like a biologist, a psychologist, and a queer rights activist? You are a lot of things right now.
Well, I think I was interested in biology, but also in a lot of sciences from when I was very young. I actually, when I was an undergrad, that's when they say you should take lots of different courses, and at least one of them should seriously tempt you away from your area of interest. So for me, that was a psychology course that did that. But at the time, even though I was interested in neuroscience and I was interested in evolution, I didn't really see psychology as being something that was sort of linked via neuroscience to my interest in biology. So I just thought of it as a completely different interest that was sort of tempting and let it go. And then I ended up doing a PhD in neuroscience, largely because those were the days when there wasn't a lot of intersectional stuff, or perhaps I didn't know of it, that really looked at ecology, evolution, and neuroscience. All of the places and people that I'd heard of and seen were people who were doing one or the other. So I picked neuroscience and then graduated and with a PhD, and then did a postdoc in ecology, which is unusual. And I also transitioned from being a PhD, doing a PhD in the US, to doing a postdoc in India, which is also unusual. But in many ways, it was really the Indian system that had the flexibility, largely because of this lack of a defined postdoc culture. And my postdoc mentor as well, who gave me the flexibility to do ecology with a background in neuroscience and to integrate all of these, these interests. And then I eventually got a job in a psychology department that was looking for a neuroscientist to teach psych, and was then jointly appointed with bio. But I guess I've always been queer, and I feel like queerness has rescued me from being just a scientist. And I think it was eventually responsible for all of the ways in which I engaged with the world that led to me being politicized away from kind of received fact. Yeah.
Wonderful. You spoke about how you did your PhD in the US and then you came back to India. So what sort of differences were there, like from the experience over there and here?
It depends, I think, on where one is. But I was at Harvard, which is a very specifically white supremacist, sexist space. So I didn't like a lot of things about the culture at Harvard. There were there's always a couple of professors, a couple of labs that sort of made things better at the time. But yeah, there was it was just a bit of a desert, social, culturally, everything. And so I enjoyed being back here. It's also, I think, a lot of has to do with what departments you're in. The neuro-heavy departments I've been in have always been largely populated by joyless people, unfortunately. And I think ecology departments have always just had nicer, happier people, right? So I think it's also department cultures, the ways in which fields build up cultures around those that sort of shaped these different experiences. Yeah.
Have to agree with that, but then I'm biased towards ecology. So. All right. So you said that it felt like a desert there. Do you think this sort of isolation is common amongst? I would say it has both factors of both race and orientation sort of playing into it. Right?
Yeah.
So what would you say about that? But in the panorama of the Indian academia, do you think all this causes some sense of isolation?
There's always isolation if one is queer, and especially if one is trans, I think. That just comes from all the biases that are stacked, systemic biases that are stacked against trans researchers. So, but also, I mean, that's not academia specific in that one is often isolated as a trans person or as a queer person. And certainly growing up, I was not just the only trans, but the only queer person I knew. There were other people, but I assumed that I assumed I knew that they were queer, and they eventually came out, but at the time they didn't. So, that always happens. And so, yeah, so it is always isolating. That's very much a defining part of it, but it's less so now. Now I have, I think, a very large fraction of the students at my institution, of the undergrad students, are queer, and a surprisingly large fraction is trans. That is to say, maybe not a large fraction, but just a large number, right? 30 to 40 students who identify as trans or non-binary. That's a good large cohort. So maybe some of these things are changing in that people are feeling freer to be open. Yeah.
Wonderful. But yes, so like you said, we as a community, we have a lot of baggage of discrimination in our social structure itself, right? And I think the academic structure right now also plays a part into it. So what would you have to say about that? Like, as in how the system of academia, how it works around here, the hierarchy of it, does that play a role in this?
A role. It does. In general, one isn't given much of a space to shape policy or to really do anything unless one is higher up, so to speak, in the hierarchy of academia. And so a lot of institutions, there have been young queer and trans kids trying to change policy and really sort of just not being heard. So it's very sad. That's also true. I mean, so when I was at the US also, I mean, when I was at grad school, I was part of the trans task force there as well. Very minor player, but then as well, it was students pushing for change. At the time, I don't think we had any openly trans faculty at Harvard. And so likewise, we're pushing from a place with not a lot of power, and student power is not very well defined there either. But I think in all of these places, when one's push is sustained and one canvasses enough support from inside and outside the institution, that eventually things move slowly. I certainly could not have imagined then that the kinds of things we were pushing for, which seemed impossible at the time and also seemed structurally impossible. So, for example, getting health insurance providers to cover surgeries. These were the kinds of things where I just assumed, that there was, we pushed, but at the time I really didn't think there was much hope to doing that, because I thought we were too small a constituency to influence large corporations. Right? It turns out that that there's enough, virtue signaling that can make a difference over time, that concessions that people don't have to make, they make because of this very interesting drive to sort of want to appear like one is doing good, even if one is a corporation that's overall doing a lot of harm, right? And that desire to not be seen as bad is a powerful force whose power we've not really fully reckoned with or used in social justice movements more widely, but something that we eventually often rely on. Yeah.
Very good point. But yes, so as you said, the higher you are in the hierarchy, the more chances you have to deal with this kind of issue. So do you think in your journey, sort of through the hierarchy, you've been able to help create a more safer space for your students, for example, and the community that surrounds you?
I know that that's happened around me, which is good. Um, Specifically for trans and queer people at a policy level. So that's nice. And also it's been, a specific consequence of the ways in which the institution that I'm in has responded, and so on. So yeah, I think there are some ways in which these things have moved. It's a tiny thing compared to what needs to the wider scale at which things need to change. Yeah.
Every little bit helps. So
yeah.
Yes, and so we went through an article that was titled "Pairing Gender, Caste, and More," the contribution that you made to that particular article, and we were curious about what actually inspired you to speak up against all of this. What inspired you into activism, being active politically, and for the community as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think with anything I've ever written, there's usually a universe of people pushing me to write things that I'm generally sort of talking about, and I'm usually resisting because I'm not a big fan of sort of, the way in which ideas get branded or stamped one's ideas, as opposed to ideas that are generally around in a community after one's one of the people writing them down, right? So it's for that reason that I'm generally hesitant to write about. About ideas such as this. And especially since we were largely addressing issues of caste and class, where I speak largely from a position of privilege, right? So that's a specific condition in which one doesn't want to be seen in any way as kind of the voice of a group or the voice of, a movement of at all. So, but I think what often happens is that I was asked to write the article. So usually what happens is somebody pushes me to write by saying, look, somebody needs to write this, so do it. And then often, especially in the STEM discourse, that happens because people are, thankfully, some of the people who've really pushed the justice around gender in science are recognizing that the woman in science discourse is not particularly inclusive of trans persons in science. So they often ask me to write as a trans person. And then often these are the only contexts in which anybody with an anti-caste perspective is being asked to write at all, right? About science policy and about exclusion in STEM. So I was just saying that even though trans people are a minuscule minority in society, the barriers to us talking about our experiences in science, especially with respect to gender, are not as severe as the barriers that are imposed before people talking about caste and caste-based marginalization. And I think the repercussions for people who are from marginalized caste backgrounds talking about caste and science is just enormous and formidable. So, so for that reason, I agreed to write that particular article, but in collaboration with other people with whom I'd been talking about these ideas with, both of whom were students at the University of Hyderabad at the time. Yeah.
My alma mater.
But both one already has a PhD and the other one is about to. So soon they will all be faculty. It should be exciting.
All right. So yes. So since we were speaking about the STEM discourse, how do you think being a scientist helps you to sort of increase the acceptance of queer and marginalized sections of our society by sort of demystifying the science behind it? So does it make it easier? Does it make it harder?
Yeah, I think that so one of the projects we're engaging now is to try and demystify the science behind being trans, right? So yes, hopefully science is always used to demystify. And of course, it's often used to also mystify and confuse people. But I think there's a good number of us in science who are really convinced of the need to effectively communicate science and to demystify and to make evidence accessible. So, yes.
So one of the main questions that we have for this particular interview is that students from both queer community and the Indian Academy in general are very vulnerable to mental health concerns due to the sort of immense pressure that is put on them from societal expectations.
Yeah.
And how do you think we can, like, as a system as a whole, how can we sort of address this and come up with some sort of solution for this?
Right. So I've been fairly vocal about the fact that I feel that the bulk of the kinds of pressures that specifically weigh upon Indian students in STEM are about 90, a large fraction of them are just entirely based on Brahminism, right? And so Brahminism is works in this particular context to sort of be a universal depressant, right? It's the social force in this context at this time that is telling students that they have to learn by rote, right? And that is somehow a form of learning. It's the force that is telling students not to ask questions, right, at one stage of their lives, for most of their lives. And then suddenly at the PhD stage is telling people, now you can start to ask questions. Once that faculty, that critical faculty is completely stamped out of them. It's also the overall force that's largely telling people not to enjoy themselves, right? Not to enjoy food, not to enjoy sex, not to enjoy anything connected to their dopaminergic systems. And so it's just generally a source of joylessness for everybody. And in STEM in particular, it reduces the quality of science we do by making us boring, repetitive, and so on, right? As a community.
If, for example, if we're focusing on like both, I would say both queer people in STEM as well as, so here in India, caste is a little more open. It's one of the first questions that a lot of people ask. Even as progressive as we say that we are these days, it's one of the first questions that a lot of people ask. It's something that's from your name, from what you look like. It's something that's sort of assumed thing. But I feel like being queer might be a little more of a sort of hidden thing. It depends on how you portray yourself in front of them. Right. So do you think it's harder for queer people to sort of be out and proud in a lot, not all of academia as a whole, but in many institutions, like you said, a lot of Brahminical institutions, for example, that it's hard for them to actually be themselves in fear of losing opportunities or facing discrimination within the STEM community?
Absolutely. There's a particularity, there's a particular sort of, not just, it's a general sort of anti-sex perspective, right? That exists in all of these spaces. And so it's very hard to talk about sexuality without that being automatically associated with kind of a loss of izzat, right? But also, of course, it's also true of people who are straight, in that you're supposed to, in the Brahminical context, be kind of straight and somehow demonstrably straight without actually having sex with somebody whom you actually desire, as opposed to somebody whom you're either being set up with, or, as is tragically the case in India, someone whom you are free to love, but who you know ahead of time must be a certain kind of person, and then you fall in love with that kind of person, which is sort of a somewhat questionable or very sad kind of love, right? Or sort of something that passes for love, shall we say? So, yes, I think that there's a sort of a pall hanging, a blight hanging over all of us. And if you're ever, I think that the good thing is that queer people here have a lot of common cause with anyone who chooses to have even a heterosexual relationship, but a relationship that is not Brahminically sanctioned, right? Intercaste, interreligious, anything that actually involves people having sex with somebody whom they're not supposed to be having sex with, right? And that thankfully is not limited to queer people in this context.
So if I'm speaking about issues of the queer community, I cannot in fact remove the issues of caste or religious issues from that, right? So I think a big part of this is this sense of segregation, as the sense of other that is created by, whether it's outside of its white supremacy here, Brahminism, there's this sense of you do not belong that is built up within us. So especially in STEM, where everything is fact-based and you're supposed to be, logical about things. How do you think that we can change this sort of feeling, both individually and as a community?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's supposed to be a fact-based system, although a lot of people don't treat it that way. So scientists carry authority whether we want to or not, and often a scientist says is substituted for an actual look at the evidence, because the evidence is often quite complicated and hard to parse. And so as the evidence becomes more and more complicated, our difficult task, which we don't always take fully seriously, is the task of making all of that comprehensible to the lay public. And that, I think, is something that we have not been very successful at doing. We're able to make our talks slightly simpler than what a scientific paper reads like, but it's still not fully accessible. Often as scientists, we're able to give general talks, which are completely accessible, but they don't connect people. There's a lot of connectivity missing between that and people actually looking at the evidence that weighs in on a particular issue to make up their minds on the subject. Yeah.
So, especially as students, for us, what do you think that we can do to, help? What can we do to make science more accessible, like you said? What can we do to make sure that everybody around us feels safe, whether that's regardless of orientation, regardless of race, of caste, any other issues? What can we do? Sort of build this into the system from the root.
Yeah, well, cultural change is often driven by students, especially when it comes to an academic field. Who else is going to drive it? And so that's where students come in. And that role can really not be played by anybody else. Changing something culturally is a large scale sort of thing, right? And already one sees a lot of cultural changes. One sees, I see a huge difference between how older scientists and younger scientists think and approach matters. But also it's heartbreaking when you see a lot of younger scientists aspire to become like older scientists, right? So those things have to change. And I think all of you will be the ones to do it.
Another question that I had was, especially for PhD and postdoc mentors, I think up till you're a sort of postgraduate level, you have more peer support, but once you're sort of thrown into your PhD, like you said, suddenly you're asking questions and everything's changed and the entire system has changed. What role can mentors play there? Because it's more of a one-on-one interaction there.
Yeah. No, so mentors have a huge role to play there, but I also think the structures of PhD programs need to change, and one needs to build emotion, not just at the PhD level, but I think from a very young age, we have to encourage experience-based learning, encourage people to ask questions based on their experience, and encourage people to and encourage the development of emotional resilience. That's something which we never do in schools. And often it is emotional reasons for which people stop doing, say, maths, right? Because they've been humiliated, they've not been supported through their own sense of failures when they try something and they fail. Those are not cognitive problems, they are emotional problems, and they're problems that we're all bound to face throughout schooling. We just face them at a heightened level at a PhD because suddenly the onus is on you as a particular individual to know more about this field than really anyone else around you, including your advisor. And, the onus is also suddenly on you to, do a lot more in terms of, being solely responsible for how you cope with that sense of failure. And so I think that that emotional training is something that we need to build into academic training from a very young age. And that's something that most of our educational systems lack.
Wonderful. I think that pretty much exhausts all the questions that I had planned for today. But is there anything else you would like to add in this context?
That's it from me. I just really hope that lots of people watch this and generally feel the urgency and the need to annihilate these structures of caste and class and gender, not just because they are unjust structures, yes, because of that, but since that's not always a compelling reason to people who come from privilege, in addition, they're just urgently necessary for each one of our own liberations from these very dreary structures that have compromised a lot of our enjoyable experiences in life, including but not limited to science education.
Thank you so much.
Yep.
This was wonderful. This was an amazing
All right.
experience.
Thank you.